The revolution teaches us a lot of things about who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed. And what I think is the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for, regardless of the difficulties we're in 2025, when there just seems to be no common ground for a lot of us. The revolution, the Civil War, World War II, they're all reminders that we've been through greater perils, existential perils in our past, and we have overcome those perils. That should be reassuring. That should give us a sense of common strength.
I didn't study the American Revolution in middle school. I studied the Tudors and Stuarts, which was far less interesting, although I'm sure just as relevant today. My children all went to school in the States, and they did study the American Revolution, and they studied the Civil War as well. And I was conscious when they were studying it that the Civil War was portrayed in all its violence and gruesomeness, and it wasn't until sort of recently that I became aware just of how gruesome the Revolutionary War was as well. I mean, 1 in 10 Americans who fought in it died, as you recount in your books. The stories of Saratoga, of 16 and 17-year-olds freezing to death in the fields with their wounds, is also something that sort of is not portrayed as much, is not as told as much as a story. And I was wondering why you felt it was important to tell that side of the story.
Yeah. You're right. The revolution in particular has kind of a faded lithograph quality to it. The blood has been leached out of the revolution, and in fact, it was a terribly bloody affair. There were at least 25,000 Americans, maybe as many as 35 to 40,000 who died. That's a larger proportion of the American population at the time to die in any of our wars, other than the Civil War, where we had 600,000 dead. Um, I think the reason that it hasn't been acknowledged to be the bloody affair that it was is in part because of distance. 250 years ago makes it hard to really feel an emotional connection to the dead in the way that we still do, I think, with the Civil War. Civil War has photographs of the dead at Gettysburg and Antietam and other places. There's none of that from the revolution. I think that for us to, first of all, acknowledge the sacrifices that were made then, as we do for the World War II generation, for example, and to fully appreciate what it is that what they did in succeeding to win this war, you have to understand the full panoply of misery and suffering, as well as the good times, the victories, the happiness, the camaraderie, and so on.
And I can see why with the Revolutionary War, because it was the war on which the country was built, that there was a need to build these figures up into almost Greek gods. Do you think they were sort of put on a pedestal, have been put on a pedestal, those revolutionary leaders? And was it because America needed that as the kind of launch pad of its narrative? It needed to build them up.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's a natural sense of believing that when you've been through an ordeal like the 8-year revolution was, that those are demigods who managed to win through. George Washington had feet of clay like all of us do. He had almost 600 slaves at Mount Vernon during his lifetime. That is a awful reminder that the prosperity of this country was largely predicated on bondage. The propagandists who were running this country at the time were so effective and so gifted as propagandists that they had really portrayed the enemy, the British, as evildoers. And so, as a consequence, that must mean we are the good doers, that the Americans were justified in all the things that they did, even though, there were atrocities committed by both sides. If you were a loyalist in this country, if you had skepticism about armed rebellion against your lawful monarch, or even if you were just skeptical about armed rebellion, you were treated dreadfully. You were subject to expropriation, jail without a bond, torture, and sometimes even execution. We kind of whitewashed that part of the revolution for years and years, decades, centuries even. We haven't fully acknowledged it, I think, even today.
Another thing that struck me from your book was this idea that, again, I think of my kids were sort of taught that there were two sides in the Revolutionary War. There were the Americans and then there were the British. But one thing that you make very clear is that there were actually many sides. I mean, there were Americans who didn't want to be independent, or Americans who didn't want to fight, or Americans who thought of themselves as British. Benjamin Franklin's own son didn't want independence.
Correct.
And again, it's that idea that the story is muddier than perhaps we were told for a couple of centuries,
And much more interesting, I
and
think.
therefore much more interesting.
Yeah, Franklin's beloved son, William, was the royal governor of New Jersey. He got the job partly through his father's influence. His father had a great deal of influence in London at one time before he was perceived to be a diehard rebel. And he just refused to buy into the notion that rebellion was legitimate. And he went to jail. And eventually into exile. And you multiply that by thousands, and you see families split apart in the same way they were in the Civil War, for example. The Civil War qualities of the American Revolution, and it was our first Civil War, extend in other ways. Indian tribes, Six Nations of the Iroquois had gotten along very well for more than a century, and the revolution forces them to choose sides. And four of those Iroquois nations remain aligned with the British, two align with the rebels, with the Americans, and they're killing each other. Uh, this is one of the aspects of the revolution that I think has not been fully appreciated by us in our history. The extent to which the war was not just between us and them, but us and us on several levels. And again, it adds a level of nuance that, for me at least, makes it a much more interesting, complex story.
And I was talking to Ken Burns recently about his documentary that I know you're a good friend of Ken's, and he was talking about these divisions, and he was comparing them in a way to, the South Vietnamese during the Tet Offensive. And to your point about how the more we understand the muddiness and the complexities and allow for the complexities, actually the more relevant that war becomes, because it has these parallels today, because all wars are complex and pit family against family and neighbor against neighbor. And perhaps I was wondering whether you felt that helped us bring it more into the present.
Well, I think when you look at America in 2025 and you see these fractious people, a sense that what is it about us that makes it difficult for us to get along with us? You can follow that thread right back to the beginnings, the origins of the country. We are a fractious people. We are a bellicose people. We are a violent people. Not easy to acknowledge. We like to
Mm.
think of ourselves as peacemakers fundamentally and a force for good. And there's that aspect of, I would argue, American history and the American people, but that is not the that is not the only thing we are. So I think that understanding, whence we come, who those people were, how difficult they could be at times, helps us, I think, to reconcile ourselves with the people we are 250 years later.
I guess your book starts with Benjamin Franklin in France asking, for support from the French. And it is another of those kind of origin stories rethinks, that there is this idea that in the Revolutionary War, America did it alone. I mean, you talk about America being divided and fractious. There's also a strong streak of doing it alone in this country. Was that something also that you were conscious of revisiting when you wrote the book?
Yeah, because otherwise it's not a true story. We don't win the war in 1783 without the French. Yeah, I mean the French initially. Okay, so Franklin's job as the first and best American diplomat in American diplomatic history is to persuade Louis XVI, his wife, of course, is Marie Antoinette, that a absolute monarchy, a Catholic monarchy, uh, should throw in its lot with Protestant, rebellious, uh, Republican wannabes.
Okay, put like that,
Um,
I see the diplomatic challenge.
it took him years, but he was very gifted, and he persuaded the French that it was in their best interest because the French had grievances against the British. They had lost the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War in this country, and it had been a terrible defeat, both in terms of territory lost and also to French pride. And so, since that war ended in 1763, the French have been looking for a way to get even. And the best way to get even, Franklin convinced them, was to support American rebels against the British, bleed them. And then the Spanish come in because the French and the Spanish are Bourbon brothers. And then eventually the Dutch are going to come in. Britain is alone. The only ally that Britain has besides 30,000 German mercenaries, is Portugal. And you're not going to win a lot of wars with Portugal on your side. So we need help. And the help we get is from the French, the Spanish, the Dutch. The Russians are sort of helping on the side. And that's an important part of the story. It's important to understand. It's important to understand when we give a thumb in the eye to our closest friends today, we should remember that we've needed those friends in the past. We will need them again in the future. It's a lesson directly from American wars in the past, starting with the Revolution. The best team wins. Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. We proved that in the Revolution. We're going to remember it in the future at some point to our pain.
Very good place to leave it. Rick Atkinson, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.